So thanks, Philip, and thanks to the entire Morgan State team. I think this has been a great event so far, and I'm very honored to be here. The talks yesterday were amazing, and I am looking forward to continuing the discussion today. So I will be talking about this paper that is kind of more recent work that is ongoing. But I wanted to start by kind of contextualizing in the type of work that I do and my orientation to work in responsible AI. So as you know, AI is now used in many different institutional settings, many different personal aspects of our lives, whether as in academia or whether as companions or therapists in personal domains. And of course, this has raised all types of enthusiasms about the type of things that it might make possible, but also it has raised lots of worries about its ethical and societal impacts in different domains. So the key question that motivates a lot of my work is, how should we think about evaluating and governing the societal and ethical impacts of AI? And particularly, are our current approaches to evaluating and governing AI in a responsible way adequate? So when I say current approaches, of course, there's a variety of approaches. There are many different ways that people go about this, but the typical way that people do, and you might have seen, is to get an AI model and look at its performance on some type of benchmark data set or benchmark task. So they are model-centric in that way, right? So you might have seen leaderboards, and that's an image of a Hugging Face, a safety leaderboard that gives particular scores to different types of language models, different types of generative AI models on their fairness and, let's see whether this works, on their fairness and toxicity or stereotypes. And there are other types of ways of evaluating this. But one of the themes underlying much of my work is that this is just one aspect of the life cycle of AI systems as they get integrated in different aspects of society. Particularly, it pertains to only this modeling and evaluation side. So in my previous work, an ongoing line of work, I argue that we need to think, when we think about the evaluating and governing the impact of AI systems in a responsible way. I think this stopped working. No.
Apologies.
Yeah. Okay. We need to adopt this kind of process-oriented way that looks at the entire pipeline from the very beginning problem formulation, where we are trying to articulate what exactly is the problem, the quantitative problem that this AI system is supposed to solve in particular institutional settings, to the way that we collect data, curate data, to that modeling and evaluation part, to its impact on individual users who might be experts in particular institutional settings, or to its interaction with different norms in different institutions, and to its uptake in society, in which it might be one among many different AI systems that is deployed in a kind of a large settings. And the idea is that if we don't do this, there is a, I think, threat that we end up treating these systems as if they're myths. I'm using the term by Roland Barthes, myth as in something that is designed by human beings in a very particular type of cultural context, but then is taken and is treated as if it's a natural object, as if it just came out of nowhere. And then people look at it, oh, look, this system has these capabilities, as if those capabilities were not the result of various modeling choices and assumptions throughout this entire pipeline. And when we do that, I think we misdiagnose many of the problems. We see the symptoms, certain disparities in model performance as the source of the problem, whereas it might be the symptom. And intervening on that symptom properly requires that we have a proper diagnosis of the source, which requires that we understand this entire pipeline. And when we do that, we might have better solutions. So in recent work, I have continued this way of thinking by focusing on some of the basically upstream sources from modeling and evaluation, including modeling and evaluation, that have to do with whose perspectives and viewpoints and values goes into the design and development of these systems. So by this, I mean, if you're designing a hate speech detection system, you need to have ground truth for what counts as hate speech, whose perspectives are involved. How do you select those participants? How do you aggregate their perspectives or their opinions when there are disagreements? Do you just do majority voting or do you do something different? Each one of these things will have implications for the performance of those systems. And each one of these things requires that we need to think carefully about this decision. So some of the works that I've done with my collaborator, Maria de Ortega, and Will Fleischer at Georgetown in DC, more recent work, have to do with these factors. And I have been fortunate to take up some of that work and collaborate with the NIST team on developing the AI risk management framework, and particularly in the context of developing what is called this map function. I don't know whether you can see this map function in the AI risk management framework of NIST. Other works that I do is about this other downstream impact. So some of these things have to do with, especially recently, people suggest that social scientists should start using large language models as surrogates for human subjects. Is that a good idea? What norms of scientific practice should govern this type of adoption in scientific practice? So some of the work that Yuan Gao is leading, and it's a fantastic work by Yuan, not me, casts doubts on this and raises some methodological issues, particularly issues that have to do with earlier parts of the pipeline. Well, we have to actually consider what type of data goes into the system, because there are serious concerns about memorization and out-of-domain performance, out-of-distribution performance. And some other works that I've done with other colleagues look at this more type of systemic impact. So you might get a sense of the behavior of an AI system in isolation by itself, but that does not necessarily tell you what our society will look like when many of these systems are implicated or adopted in social contexts where people have their own kind of biases. So some of the work, for instance, that I've done with Niliana Akpinar, who's currently a postdoc at Amazon, probably on the job market next year. Great researcher. Like, if your universities are looking for somebody who works in this line of work, is to looking at how social media algorithms that look good in the abstract by themselves might exacerbate certain dynamics of invisibility in academic contexts, particularly pushing down the visibility of researchers from minority backgrounds. So the work that I want to talk about today belongs to this line, belongs to the impact of AI with respect to users in particular type of context. And it's a work with my collaborator, Mika Maniani, who's in the same department as me, in fact, jointly appointed in the same way as me in computer science and philosophy. And this kind of pertains to the impact that the AI systems have on the way that we might imagine what is possible for us. So how many of you know this person? No, nobody. So this is, I didn't know this person either 1 year ago. This is Kenza Leili, and it is an influencer from Morocco, completely AI generated. So all of the images, videos, speeches are generated by AI and has 213K followers last time I checked. And why is Kenza famous? Because it has won the first Miss AI competition. And after winning this competition, gave this particular speech where it said, winning Miss AI motivates me even more to continue my work in advancing AI technology. As we move forward, I am committed to promoting diversity and inclusivity within the field, ensuring that everyone has a seat at the table of technological progress. I mean, I might have said these things in certain contexts as well, but so stepping back for a second, you might think, oh, well, on the face of it, it's just like, seems some weird thing going on. But at the same time, it's from another perspective quite astounding that like everything here, speech, image, videos are AI generated. And that just like shows kind of maybe in a too much of a dramatic way, the way that these systems, especially generative AI systems, now have this seeming capability of coming up with novel concepts, novel narratives, novel representations. And because of that, they now kind of permeate almost all aspects of our lives. Many students that I have talk to these AI systems on a daily basis as chatbots. People look to these, I have friends that try to get dating advice from these AI systems by saying, oh, how do you interpret this message? They're used in many different sectors, creative sectors, industry, advertisement sectors, and they are even used in scientific communities, of course, to generate ideas. And of course, in that way, they can shape the way that we think about our world. And because of that, the way that we think about what is possible for us and what is possible for our society. Needless to say, a lot of people are very worried about this. They are concerned that because of the way that these systems are designed, because of the data sets that inform them, because of the optimization objective that they have, they might just replicate patterns from the past. And so entrap us in a particular way in patterns that have already been going on and perpetuating certain type of injustices and invisibilities, making certain possibilities less salient for us. So the paper with Mika, what we want to do, and I'm very looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it, is to come up with some type of conceptual resource for better articulating some of these concerns about the impact of AI and how we think about what is possible for us in our society, our imagination. So we do three things. We provide this concept of aspirational affordance to talk about the way that representational technologies and narratives can shape how we might think certain things are possible for us and certain things are less possible, or certain possibilities are less salient in our imagination. We provide three reasons to why we should really care about how AI is shaping this landscape of aspirational affordances, landscape of technologies that are impacting our self-conception and imagination. And finally, we kind of provide this notion of aspirational harms to hopefully provide a better articulation of some of the concerns about the harms of AI, particularly distinguishing it from harms that are called allocative harms and representational harms. So I will talk about those more. Okay, so I think it shouldn't be any surprise, like everybody now knows that novels, movies, art, many other things impact the way that we think of ourselves and our ideals, what we want to become. If I say that, oh, like, can you tell me a movie that gives you a very kind of good ideal of what romance or what friendship or what kind of anything else looks like what is a good norm of masculinity, you probably know some examples. Or if I tell you something that you think provides very bad norms or very bad aspirational benchmark for people, you probably have some ideas what those might be, right? So this is not a new thing, and people have done a lot of work trying to understand the psychological mechanisms by which these representations and narratives that is communicated in the media impacts us, by which repeated exposure to these things might make certain possibilities or certain types of ideals more salient for us, while making certain type of possibilities look threatening, the things that are not worth pursuing. So we want to kind of introduce this notion of aspirational affordances to capture these type of possibilities. The notion of affordances comes from this background in ecological psychology, especially the work by J.J. Gibson. For Gibson, the idea of affordances was that when we look at the environment, we don't see the environment or any other organism as something that is kind of neutral. Rather, we see it with respect to the type of possibilities for action that are available for creatures for us. So his idea was that perception and action are kind of deeply intertwined. And that has a very important implication for the way that we have to understand the psychology of different organisms. So for Gibson says, the affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes either for good or ill. I mean by affordances something that refers to both the environment and the animal in a way that no existing term does. It implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment. So the idea is that there's this type of relationality between the animal and the environment here. Some aspects of the environment that affords the possibility of hiding for one organism does not afford the same possibility for another one. An aspect of environment that affords the possibility of climbing for one organism does not afford the same possibility for another one. And so specifying affordances unlike specifying properties of particular artifact, requires that we don't just think about what are the properties or characteristics of the artifact, but also what are the characteristics and capabilities of the agent that is interacting with that artifact, and what is the social context. So if you want to understand what climbability of a stair, flight of stairs is, we need to understand the properties of the stairs, and we need to understand properties of who the climber is going to be, as well as certain things potentially about the contextual situation. Is it slippery? What is the surface? Or maybe even if it's socially prohibited to do that or not. And so this idea of affordances have been used in, has been explored in the cognitive sciences, in robotics, to better understand how organisms, artificial and natural, might perceive the environment in this way. And it's been put to use in very fruitfully in the context of design as well. So Don Norman first introduced this in this context, where the idea was that when we design the objects in a particular way that corresponds to the kind of bodily movement of agents, it becomes a lot more intuitive for them to use it. So if you see the door that has no handle, you know immediately that you can push it. Whereas if the door has handle, you're kind of stuck thinking cognitively between, is it a push or a pull, right? So that's the idea. You don't need to kind of overthink it if you design it properly. And more recently, Jenny Davis has done a fantastic work putting these things and particularly highlighting the implications that they have with respect to power and politics. And I will talk a little bit about that more. Okay, so the type of affordances that we are interested in, they implicate, on the one hand, the representational properties of the artifacts, the narrative representation. On the other hand, the cognitive capabilities and characteristics of users, the viewers, the perceivers, right? And so these are kind of similar to cognitive affordances, and particularly the part of cognition that we're interested in our imagination, right? The way that this type of cognitive representation shape our ideals, the way that they shape our cognitive evaluations, for instance, by if you repeatedly make me think that some type of possibility is not feasible, then I might actually change my preferences about what I'm going to do. If you make me think that something is inevitable, that will change my behavior, that will change my imagination. And so that's the idea. And this is nice because it provides, and it's a cumbersome way of putting it, but an articulated way of bridging what is called the socio-technical gap. What do I mean by that? Socio-technical gap is basically a term that this team at DeepMind, Laura Weidinger and others, suggested for this gap precisely between this type of model-centric evaluations and the impact that the models have, or the output of the models have on user mentality. Right? So an example that might be kind of very vivid or like in some people's mind is that there might be a model that in the abstract has no stereotype when evaluated with respect to a particular benchmark. So things look great, but people or designers that did it in a particular way that when it's actually deployed in a particular society, people find it either amusing or ridiculous or jarring or useless. Some of the interesting work that people have done, for instance, as Microsoft research shows that these systems that are seemingly free of stereotypes, actually their impact depends a lot on who is the perceiver of the system, who is actually interacting with those systems. And so we need to kind of bridge this gap between the model property and its psychological impact. And affordances do that in a nice way because, one, they are relational by themselves. Remember the example of climbing. But two, people in organizational research and information sciences have developed this very nice framework of going from affordances to perception of affordances to actualization of affordances, and articulating some of the steps and resources that are needed for each of these parts. So even if there is something that is environment that affords a certain type of possibility in principle to you, you might still need to learn some things before perceiving it. So Excel might afford certain possibilities for programming, but not if you don't know how to do it. A book affords possibilities of imagining, but not if you don't know how to read it. So perception of affordances requires certain type of learning or certain type of resources. and not everybody might have those. Similarly, actualization of affordances depends on the incentives, depends on what constraints there are, and depends on what alternatives there are, right? You might know how to program with Excel, but not if something easier is around, right? Like who would spend a lot of time programming with Excel? You might, on the other hand, find it extremely kind of tempting to just accept all the cookies on a particular website. But if your incentives are against that, you might somehow resist that affordance, resist that pull, right? So it's not deterministic that there's an affordance in the object and then it will be actualized. And I think this is a very nice feature of these affordances. And that the next thing that I will talk about later is precisely this idea that when we think about these affordances, when we think about these ideas of incentives, constraints, and resources, and all of these capabilities, then we have this nice way of thinking about not just, oh, this artifact affords this possibility, but affords for whom? Because people are different in terms of the capabilities and resources that they have. Okay, so this was aspirational affordances. We know that every technology gives us this type of affordances. Why particularly care about AI? So we consider three reasons for why this is important. One is that AI's influence is more potent potentially than other technologies. Why is that? Because people are interacting with these things in very intimate ways. They are having dynamic, ongoing conversations with them, especially maybe teenagers who might be even more vulnerable to them. And this is not the type of thing that they might do with typical representational or narrative artifacts, typical novel or typical movie. And no, it's not just that, it's also that through this conversation, these artifacts are designed to be persuasive. And in many cases now seem to be even more persuasive than their human counterparts. So you put these things together, is that the users become particularly vulnerable to this type of technology because they're engaged in dynamic conversational exchanges that are designed to be persuasive and personalized. So if the artifact affords a particular type of possibility for imagination, it's not just that it affords that, it's also that that possibility is even more salient than a traditional artifact, than a novel. And whereas for a typical novel, this type of possibilities might remain in the realm of public scrutiny. Like, so you see a TV show, then you can go and discuss with somebody else whether you like it, whether what you thought about the ideal that it presented. In these cases, much of the discussion really is in private. Much of the discussion really unfolds in private. And so again, this is outside the realm of scrutiny. So if previously you could have resisted the pull of these cookies, now it's a lot more difficult. The second reason is that the influence of AI in this domain is not just incremental. That is, we have mass media and then AI provides another set of representations or narratives that can influence us. But rather, it is, to use a term introduced by Neil Postman, ecological. Why is that? Because now, it's not just that we are just interacting with the result of or output of the AI systems by ourselves, but now people in many different aspects of many different sectors are using AI systems. So perhaps even unbeknownst to us, we are interacting with the output of these systems in a way that completely kind of surround us, right? And what is happening in the current workforce seems to at least point towards this tendency to be just worse. Like a lot of jobs might be either augmented or displaced in this direction. So this means that we will have reduced awareness. This means that if AI systems increase the creativity at an individual level, there might still be concerns about how they might do that at the collective level. Lisa Messeri and Molly Crockett has a very nice paper on this. And as other works show, the impact of the homogenization of AI systems might be particularly worse for historically underrepresented or disadvantaged groups, or groups who are less represented in the data. Okay, and then the final thing that I will just like go on quickly, I can talk about it more, but is that it's not just that this impact is ecological, is that most of the impact is just coming from few corporations, right? Most of the systems are just designed by few corporations. Now you might think that if we have open models, that might make things better, but I think there are good arguments to think that just having open weight models is not going to change a lot, because there are lots of resources needed to run the models, that it's not just a matter of open weight. So again, this might mean that we lose the type of heterogeneity that we typically have. So if in the kind of the typical setting, there were lots of different publishers publishing different types of things, in this type of setting, if there's a technology that is pushing in a certain one type of direction and they're controlled by a few systems, the worries about homogeneity becomes a lot worse. All right, so we need to care about this. How should we care about this? We introduced this notion of aspirational harms, which is basically, that's a lot of text, so you can ignore it, but basically the idea is that AI is giving us representations, narrative, or more generally, hermeneutic resources, interpretive tools for making sense of our surroundings and the possibilities that we can think about. And it can be harmful if they systematically shape those possibilities in a way that impacts the aspiration formation of certain groups. Right? One thing that is, I think, useful is to distinguish this type of aspirational harms, which are harms on the cognition and imagination of individuals, from other types of harms that this literature typically focuses on. So typically people are concerned either about allocative harms, which is when the use of AI system might result in disparities in allocation of opportunities or resources. So who gets certain type of healthcare treatment, who gets loan, and so on and so forth. Or representational harm, where people are concerned about how AI might perpetuate certain type of harmful stereotypes. Allocative harm, aspirational harms are different from these two things. And I think it might be useful to go through some examples to see why that might be. So as one example, imagine the use of AI in career counseling. I don't know whether Morgan State does that, but many universities either developing their own system or providing their students with do's and don'ts for how they might deploy or how they might employ different types of AI that is readily available for these type of purposes. So for instance, the students might ask the AI system, what are the good verbs that I can use in my CV or in my cover letter for this type of job? Or what is the type of vision that I can, vision board or roadmap that I can develop for as someone who's interested in this field? Now, if you've done NLP or work on language models, you know that this type of prompts can result in a lot of bias. But there are also debiasing techniques. So imagine that we have a kind of bias-free AI in the sense that it has tried to get rid of a statistical association between, let's say, gender and particular jobs, like between being a woman and being a computer scientist. A bias that we know that in many typical settings exists. Suppose that in this case that there is not. But suppose the system reinforces a particular archetype of what success looks like, a particular type of verb for what type of success looks like. So something like a success would look like as being perseverant, being resilient, and having an ability to thrive in male-dominated environments. Right? So from one perspective, you might think that, well, this improves the representation in the sense that there's nothing wrong with the representation. But on the other hand, it promotes a particularly narrow vision of what success looks like for particular groups. And of course, this is not a completely made up scenario. As we know, in many different domains, this type of kind of perspectives about like, oh, what it means to be a successful person of this type of identity is associated with particular stereotypes that on the face of them, they might look good. But when you think about it, it's like, well, it emerges from a history of inequity, it emerges from a context that is not necessarily equal. And importantly, this type of thing can actually emerge in the context of the typical mitigation strategies that are also used in machine learning. The mitigation strategies that people use to get rid of association between, let's say, gender and particular type of attributes. So it's something that could easily emerge. And another paper actually that is relevant there that I forgot to put there is the marked persona paper. That is a very nice paper by Mira Chang and S. Indormas. And so two things that are worth noting here is that these systems will not necessarily have a representational harm because there's no kind of immediate stereotype that is harmful. There's no immediate allocative harm. But there's an aspirational harm, right? So I think one lesson from here is that the harms of representation, or the harms that might ensue from a representation of AI, is not necessarily representational harm of AI, which I think I've seen a lot conflated in the literature. Another thing is that, as I said, this vision of success or archetype of success itself is shaped by a particular history that might not be the type of thing that we want. And when we perpetuate that archetype of success, we are somehow endorsing that history. So this shows that kind of this mutual reinforcement between these different types of harms. If you perpetuate a particular vision of what counts as success, then that might result in certain type of stereotypes for lack of success and so on and so forth. Another example, kind of these examples go like more and more broad as we go. So imagine the use of AI for like, thinking about futures or alternative possibilities more generally. Now, like some of the use cases that I've seen like are interesting. There are some use cases for environment that are like trying to steer people towards good environmental choices. Oh, imagine if your city looked like this. That seems like making good decisions. So like prompting people to make good decisions. Other types of thing is, so this is like an interesting thing that somebody had done, that future you is aiming to reduce people's anxiety, but by allowing them to interact with their future self. I don't know whether it will reduce anybody's anxiety or enhance your anxiety. So like, oh, can I talk to my future self? And no, actually, it's dead. It's not a good thing. Anyways, so there are all these different types of use cases, but of course, when we prompt these systems, as you have prompted them, like typically our prompts are pretty abstract, right? Our prompts are concise, and the type of output that we get from these prompts are pretty elaborate. So immediate question is, when we give an abstract concept and it's like made concrete in terms of a particular elaborate vision, how were those choices made, right? What did the system decide to elaborate in the prompt, and why and how? So one example here that might be interesting is, how many of you know about the woman life freedom movement in Iran, the protests that were going on a few years ago? So as you can see, the women of Iran, school children, were not happy with the regime. And I think this nice quote by Asef Bayat, sociologist, captured it, which is like, it feels like the movement, a paradigm shift in Iranian subjectivities has occurred. This is reflected in the centrality of women and their dignity, which relates more broadly to human dignity. This is a movement to reclaim life. People feel that the normal life has been denied to them by a regime of elderly clerical men. So it's a movement that started from opposition to mandatory hijab, right? So clearly, when we say, hey, what is your vision of the Iran of the future? Those school children have very different vision about what that future should look like from the elderly clerics. But when you prompt a system, let's say ChatGPT, like or GPT-4 through the ChatGPT interface, what create an image of Iranian girls standing in front of their school in 2040, you can see that whose aspiration has won and how that future has been imagined, right? So this is not supposed to be kind of like, I'm not claiming that I did an audit of OpenAI's system or anything. This is just a basic point that our aspirations about the future of our society can show a lot of conflict. And those conflicts can be resolved in different ways. And the way that we resolve them can itself express a certain form of oppression. I think that's basic, right? And this, for people who are actually interested about what the source of this problem is, I think one of the things that I noticed, it might be in the way that the OpenAI expands or engineers its prompts. So that might be an interesting thing to look at. When you give a particular prompt, OpenAI's first uses GPT, whatever GPT is there at the moment, GPT-4, let's say, to expand the prompt, because they have found that that allows more elaborate output, more varied output, and then they give that as input to DALL-E. So that's kind of interesting. Anyways, so again, we have this case of different aspirations about the futures by promoting some vision of what future should look like. So in the future, in the previous case, you saw it's a vision that is technologically advanced, like there's like if you look at the prompt, it says that they are wearing kind of traditional clothes that has its own like air conditioner or something. It's like insane. And there are drones in the air. So it's technologically advanced, but socially and politically conservative, right? And you might even imagine that perhaps OpenAI or any other company, I don't know the reasons, but maybe they put safeguards there on purpose because it's less risky. But again, this can cause aspirational harms, not just for Iranian women, of course, but many different users, because that changes what you take to be a normal vision of the future, especially if lots of people use it and then it permeates through the entire ecosystem of representation, right? And that can also erode hope. When you see something as inevitable, that can change with how much effort you're willing to put into it, right? And so the last example, the use of generative AI even more broadly for providing AI summaries, providing predictive text, providing explanations, and so on and so forth, right? So you probably have seen now, whatever you search on Google, you might see an AI summary of like providing you with some type of explanations and the mechanisms and the causes and so on and so forth, right? And so these can change the way that people think about a particular issue, but the way that they even sometimes express their own perspective. So some of the research here, very interesting research, has not only highlighted the potential for biases in these type of summaries and these type of predictive text suggestions, but also the way that they can shape people's attitudes, even when they are told that these systems might be biased and they should be careful. And so even on controversial topics, they are given one particular type of suggestions, and that shifts their attitude towards the topic, right? So this should kind of, again, give us cause for concern. What the AI summary is doing is providing us with a mediation between an understanding of social reality and the way that we can imagine what else is possible given that reality. That is, social conditions that might include things like oppression and injustice, and the way that we imagine alternative histories, right? And so this can have a variety of impacts. And I think one interesting psychological theory to look at here is the system justifications theory, which is a theory that says basically people are very likely to provide justifications of the status quo. So provide explanations that justify the status quo. And this is true even among the disadvantaged group. Not, of course, not everyone, but a lot of people. And they showed how this impacts many other aspects of harms that we talked about, how it impacts downstream opportunities that people look forward to, how it impacts their support for particular social causes, because they just think that, well, this is what it is. The normal is the normal, so to speak, right? And so the concern here then is that we need to at least consider what type of explanations are foregrounded by these systems, what type of possibilities are shown as the type of things that are inevitable, what type of things are shown as type of things that are threatening or less plausible. Okay, so these were the three things. There are lots of things that remain to be done. I think there's kind of a lot more work to be done on the further normative characterizations of these type of harms. Most of the examples that I gave, I related it to some type of existing injustice. I think it's interesting to think whether that's necessary. I think there might be other types of harms that might arise from false affordances. So if you remember the example of the door that might have handle, it might give you the false affordance that, let's say, you can push it or pull it or something that might not be intended by the object. So is it also possible that we might provide certain type of representation of an ideal future to someone that has no basis in reality whatsoever and do them harm rather than any good in that way, especially in terms of practical agency? There's work to be done in terms of mapping sources of aspirational affordances, anything from the way that the kind of what impacts a pre-trained model to impacts of alignment techniques like reinforcement learning from human feedback to constitutional rule set. So all of those safeguards that might have come up in the example of the Iranian girls, like maybe we don't want to kind of make any government upset with us, or maybe we want to respect social traditions. So there are trade-offs there, right? So what are the sources of those things? Prompt optimization, another one. Measuring these things, so some of the things that I'm doing with a colleague right now is trying to provide empirical measurement of some of these impacts. contracting them, what is the right way of doing it, and finally, maybe there are also positive aspirational affordances. I focused on the aspirational harms, but maybe there are things that our imagination gets stuck at for the wrong reasons. There are maybe there are cognitive biases that we have that prevent us from like thinking thoughts that could be very useful for us, imagining possibilities that could be very useful for us. And so like thinking about what those possibilities are. And I think that's it. Thank you.
All right, we have time for a few questions. That's all. Hand here and hand in the back.
I have so many thoughts, but so I guess the two kind of related questions. The first one was, you know, the risk of representational and allocative harms that you know AI produces, kind of probably gives rise to you know, certain kinds of obligations to how we ought to build them. I was wondering if you think that the risk of aspirational harms give rise to any kind of unique obligations that we might have in terms of the kind of affordances we should kind of prohibit them from having and so on. And then in the other direction, like what are your aspirations for aspirational affordances? Like what kinds of like positive obligations we have to, like, what should we be trying to give people in creating AI?
Yeah, that's great. Good. Those are great questions. And I think they're kind of in line with basically this vision of, okay, because partly answering that requires thinking what would the world look like when there's like no aspirational harm, let's say, right? What is, so setting that type of benchmark and setting some way of achieving it. I don't have a good answer for what the benchmark is, but I have some maybe less satisfying answers for how we can counteract some of the harms that we saw. And I think counteracting those things, some of the work that we saw yesterday were about community-informed input into the systems, right? So how would things look like if the people of a particular community, let's say when we are presenting what the image of the future of the Iranian women would be, people from local context with familiarity with that context had a say about those, whether those associations are good or not, right? So that would be one type of thing that we could do. The other type of thing that we could do that I think is useful is just making the issue kind of a little bit explicit. Like explanation, as we know, is not explanation or any other thing that involves selection is not a neutral thing. Whenever we foreground something, we are making an impact, right? So that would be the other type of thing. Coming up with technologies, maybe in the prompt optimization. So some type of work that has been done here is where for, I don't know if you're familiar with that unmarked persona paper. Okay, we can talk about that more. But so that type of work provides, I think, a useful line for investigating at least or surfacing some of these type of tendencies. So unmarked persona basically is that certain type of categories, socio-linguistic concepts, certain type of categories, let's say nurse, have a default woman. Like you never say like female nurse because typically people assume that like, oh, you have to qualify for the male part. Similarly for doctor, people say like female doctor as opposed to male doctor. So I think those type of tools will provide a way of articulating some of this. And that's part of my aspiration for aspirational harms.
Okay, we have a question back here.
Thanks, Sina. I'm thinking about the, I don't know, narrative entropy that you're going to experience when you have users with the affordance of a text box that signifies that they can say whatever they want. And then the model, on the other hand, which is non-deterministic, also is going to give us a bit of that narrative entropy.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part, sorry.
I said the model is also on the other end going to give us a bit of that narrative entropy as well. And so how are we reconciling the aspirational affordance of unlimited text and then the output, which also can be highly entropic, confabulated at the same time? It's just challenging for me to reconcile those two on their own, but then bringing them together, I'm computationally trying to figure out how we represent an appropriate way for having an aspirational affordance when we have so much of that narrative entropy inherent in the system?
So I'm not completely sure whether I heard everything, but I mean some of the basic thing is that when somebody prompts the system without any particular specification, like if we put the personalization, if somebody uses their personal accounts, that might change things. But if you prompt the system with something, it will give you a default output, right? Of course, there might be a lot of things in the pre-trained model. Of course, there might be a lot of things that maybe a little bit kind of further restricted in the model with all the safeguards on top, but still it gives you a default response. If you do that 1,000 times, that default might vary to different extents, but in some cases it doesn't vary that much. So this is the kind of the basic idea of what is the default that the system is presenting, and how much can that default shape somebody's thoughts about a particular issue or attitudes about a particular issue. So this is the studies that I alluded to. Also, like you could ask other types of questions, like how much can you intervene with other types of prompt to change that default? It turns out that even in some cases, that's not very easy, but that depends on the particular source of the issue. So again, if it's the safeguard or if it's the inherent thing in the system. So I don't know whether this answers your question. It's in some cases, I would say that properties or the characteristics of the outputs are stable enough. That's another way of putting it. Stable enough, that is that the entropy in the data based on which that model draws that output is reduced enough such that then we can meaningfully use this lens as a meaningful way of thinking about the impact of the output.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. And one of the poignant things for me was around the schoolgirls, the Iranian schoolgirls. And it really made me think about, as we have children who I guess would be more native to this technology than, say, me, right? And as we're talking about this idea of aspiration and the difference between my experience and our more native learners, right? And they're having the understanding of creating their experience, their lived experience, and understanding how to keep their aspirations, as well as interpreting and understanding how to properly use this tool of AI, right? And how that would be very different from my age, because I've lived a whole lot longer, and now I'm trying to figure out how to use this tool to properly use this tool and incorporate it with my aspirations. And so how do you kind of reconcile those two things in the research? Because it's two totally different, maybe it is, maybe it's not, right? The science behind it, like how do you reconcile that in the experiences and aspirations?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting issue because one of the I was giving this talk somewhere and somebody mentioned that a lot of your examples are children. So yeah, that's very true. And I think the issue, one very interesting issue there that will come up in the way that we are looking at to empirically examining some of these issues. When I said as kind of affordances depend on both the characteristics of the output, subject, and also context. The context in this particular case, when we are talking about imagination, of course, is partly other types of beliefs and other types of skills that somebody has. If somebody has very entrenched beliefs about something, it's very unlikely that something would easily change those beliefs or whether they could learn certain types of things. On the other hand, I think, so that might make certain affordances, let's say, less salient, or make it the case that it's not even an affordance for somebody who has completely entrenched beliefs about certain type of issues, about what it is worth striving for, what type of society, what type of personality, right? But on the other hand, I think one of the interesting things then is when you do have that knowledge that enables you to come up and scrutinize whether some of these affordances are useful or not. Whereas if somebody does not have that additional setting, they cannot do that. So yeah, kind of controlling for this type of background belief, which is like precisely a function of age, precisely a function of lived experience, and the type of engagement that somebody has with the issues, right? Like it couldn't be age, but like the example of the Iranian girls, right? Has somebody actually lived there? I think it's going to be very interesting in terms of seeing to what extent will it have impact on somebody's psychology. But it's an empirical question, so to speak. Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
please join me in thanking our speaker. Thank you so much, Sina.